Senate Committee on Banking, Housing, and Urban Affairs will come to order. Before we begin, I will probably embarrass her, but want to call her out. Irene Gray is working her last week as a stenographer in the United States Senate. She has been here for 27 years, and we thank her for her quiet, effective, really crucial work to preserve the hearings, even when Senator Toomey and I don't say much of note. She still has to take it down. So just appreciate your good work for this country and your unsung hero as a public servant, contracted or not as a public servant. So thank you. Thank you. This hearing is in a hybrid format. 4 of our witnesses are joining us in person, sitting in front of Senator Toomey and me. Ms. Morey is joining remotely. 1 or more of our committee colleagues may attend from their offices. Yesterday was the first of the month. For millions of Americans, that means the rent was due. For many renters, that rent keeps going up and up and up. 2 weeks ago in this committee, we heard from witnesses about the soaring cost of housing, how it hurts the millions of families priced out of buying their first home and imperils the renters who are just one illness or job loss or car repair away from eviction, as one of our witnesses documented in his book. This problem is squeezing people all across the country, working all kinds of jobs, even jobs that were supposed to be a ticket to the middle class. It's not a new problem. For decades, so many Americans have struggled to scrape together the rent each month. Too many have lived in shoddy housing with rodents or mold or broken appliances. That's why 90 years ago, this country began investing in affordable housing so that everyone would have a safe, affordable place to live. But the funding we put into that effort has never kept up with renters' needs or even the basic maintenance of aging, federally assisted housing. For the past decade, about half of renters have been paying more than 1/3 of their incomes just to keep a roof over their heads, and we know renters' challenges are only getting worse. We're 3.8 million homes short, 3.8 million homes short of what we need. Not a single state in the country has enough housing. For the lowest income renters, there are just 36 units affordable and available for every 100 renters who need them. That means renters can't, as we might say, vote with their feet in the housing market because there's nowhere for them to go. This huge shortage of housing means that renters have to make do with what they've got, even if their house has dangerous lead paint in the walls, or the landlord won't fix the heat, or their bathtub's been clogged for weeks. With housing so difficult to find, renters are forced to ask themselves whether it's worth it to push for a repair from the same person who can put an eviction on their record and decide whether they have a place to sleep at night. The shortage of housing also means rents are going up for pretty much everyone. Rents are up 15% nationally compared to a year ago. Some cities like Austin, Texas, or Senator Menendez on this committee, his city of Newark, our rents are up more than 25%. When rents rise, it makes everything in someone's life just a little bit more precarious. More and more families are one emergency away from losing their home. Renters see the pain from these rent increases, the missed trips to visit family, the car repairs they're forced to put off, the second job they have to take just to make ends meet. Wall Street investors just see opportunity. They don't see the pain, or they just don't care. More and more investors are buying up single-family homes that first-time homebuyers usually buy, and renting them out at sky-high rates. 28% of homes sold at the beginning of this year went to investors. Think about that. Investors, too often from out of town, who don't care about the community and just want to make a quick buck, are buying more than a quarter of homes. Not bought by families who want to put down roots, who dream of seeing their kids grow up in that neighborhood and go to that local school. That number is up from 16% just a couple of years ago. The biggest investors with the deepest pockets, the ones who own more than 100 properties, nearly doubled their share of their purchases. Ms. Brunner is seen firsthand in Cincinnati, where a single company based in Texas bought up 29 properties in one street in Price Hill, 29 properties on a single street. In that neighborhood, now more than half of all homes are rentals. The city's left to chase down these out-of-state landlords who are letting these homes fall apart. Families need a landlord they can talk to who lives in the community. Cities need landlords who want to actually take care of their buildings and help families stay in their homes. But big Wall Street firms promising investors double-digit yields and running up double-digit eviction rates are pricing out those who make a community home. Good landlords, renters, first-time home buyers alike. They aren't just buying up single-family homes. They're targeting mobile home communities and apartment buildings. We see that across the country, anywhere that adds to their own bottom lines. Last week, the House Select Subcommittee on the Coronavirus Crisis published a report showing that at the height of the pandemic, 4 of these massive landlords, 4, filed nearly 15,000 evictions. 4 landlords, 15,000 evictions. When a renter who's fallen behind on rent or can't get her landlord to fix her heat, we often hear that's her individual problem. We hear it's just between the renter and his landlord, or there's local governments to blame for its bad policies. And it's true that every eviction, every rent hike, every unlivable home is a personal crisis for an individual family. But all of these individual crises have added up to a big national problem. It costs all of us more in education costs when kids have to change schools every 6 months or so. It costs all of us in lost productivity when the workers who support our business and schools and our first responders can't find an affordable place to live. It costs all of us more in health care when people can't store their medicine because they don't have a place to live. It isn't someone else's problem. It affects all of us, and we need to work together to solve it. We have to expand the supply of safe, affordable housing across the country for renters and homeowners at all income levels. We have to maintain the affordable housing we currently have so we don't fall even further behind on our housing supply, and we have to help renters find and remain in homes they can afford with financial assistance, including emergency assistance, and support bipartisan prevention efforts like mediation through the Bipartisan Eviction Crisis Act. I look forward to hearing from our witnesses today about how we can tackle these challenges facing renters and grow the number of good landlords. It will benefit all of us. Senator Toomey.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Let me join the chairman in recognizing and thanking Ms. Irene Gray for her years of service to the committee, to the Senate, and to the country. We really do appreciate your good, solid, consistent, hard work. Thank you. Fact is, across America, every month, Americans are falling further and further behind because of President Biden out-of-control inflation. Paychecks are not keeping up with rising prices. After adjusting for inflation, wages have declined 5% since President Biden took office. The fact is, working Americans are getting poorer every day. And our Democrat colleagues' wasteful spending, growth-killing regulation, and the excessively accommodative monetary policy are exactly what caused 40-year high inflation and now an economic contraction. And what is the response we hear from our Democratic colleagues? They want to jam through a reckless tax and spending bill that will make this disastrous situation even worse. Hiking corporate taxes will slow economic growth and especially harm Americans' manufacturing sector, and spending billions more will fuel inflation. This new wasteful spending will mostly go towards corporate welfare for green energy, subsidies for wealthy people to buy Teslas, and a political handout right before the elections to higher-income Americans who buy Obamacare plans. In addition, the bill includes spending on housing, which is the topic of today's hearing. Under the Biden administration, of course, the cost of housing has skyrocketed. Housing prices increased 18% in the last 12 months. Rents have jumped 14%. Affordable housing is growing further and further out of reach for many. But you wouldn't know that from reading the Democrats' bill. Its housing provision creates a $1 billion slush fund for greening subsidized housing. I guess the theory is, at a time of surging housing costs, the solution is to put solar panels on Section 8 housing. As I've said before, government, and especially this administration, have often been the problem, not the solution, when it comes to housing. There are countless ways that needless government regulation drives up housing costs. Time-consuming permitting processes drive up the cost of building new rental housing. Overly burdensome environmental impact reviews further add to the cost. Tariffs on steel, lumber, and other building materials have the same effect. Rent control laws reduce the supply and quality of rental housing. Demand-side housing subsidies get capitalized into higher house prices and higher rents. Loose GSE and FHA underwriting standards drive those house prices and rents still higher. The GSEs then respond by subsidizing investors in single-family rental housing, but that just further drives up house prices and crowds out aspiring homeowners. More recently, the Democrats and this administration have taken this government failure to the next level. They've dropped hundreds of billions of dollars of helicopter money to stimulate an already strong economy. $80 billion of that went to rental assistance, vouchers, and other housing subsidies, further inflaming demand. The president even extended the illegal eviction moratorium that has deterred investment in new rental housing, excuse me, and led to some renters not paying rent even when they could afford to. Predictably, landlords have responded by increasing rents and requiring larger security deposits. Today, the Democrats will propose more of the same. We'll likely hear them make the case for new so-called tenant protections. We'll likely hear them arguing for making the COVID rental assistance program permanent. But doubling down on failed liberal housing policies is not going to fix our rental housing market. Instead, it will tend to make housing more expensive. Today, we'll also hear from landlords about how government intervention makes it harder and more expensive to be a landlord, and that leads to higher costs for renters. To improve housing affordability for all Americans, whether renters or owners, we should pursue reforms that leverage the power of free enterprise to increase housing supply and make markets more competitive. A healthy market competes not just on price, but also service and product quality. To that end, we should scale back the role of government and increase the role of private capital. We should avoid the temptation to adopt new so-called tenant protections or permanent rental assistance that will have negative, unintended consequences, including increasing housing costs. We should phase out demand-side subsidies that drive housing costs higher. We should end the failed GSE model that fosters excessive risk-taking and contributes to a boom-bust housing cycle. Localities should revisit their permitting processes and other obstacles to new housing construction. We should prohibit the GSE and other federal programs from subsidizing rental units in jurisdictions that impose rent controls, and we should get the GSEs out of the business of subsidizing single-family home investors. And we should keep the GSEs focused on their affordability mission by keeping them out of social policy. Meanwhile, I hope the administration will finally engage on housing reform. Treasury has still not met its obligation to deliver a housing reform plan to Congress. It's now 10 months overdue. Instead of pushing a reckless tax and spending bill, the administration should look to opportunities for bipartisan legislation like the housing finance reform that relies on free enterprise, not government, to make housing more affordable for more Americans, whether they own or rent. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Toomey. I will now introduce the 5 witnesses. Professor Matthew Desmond is the Maurice Professor of Sociology at Princeton and the author of the book Evicted. He's also director of the Eviction Lab at Princeton. Mr. Desmond, welcome. Ms. Laura Brunner is President and Chief Executive Officer of the Port of Greater Cincinnati Development Authority in Hamilton County, Ohio. Prior to joining the port in 2011, Ms. Brunner spent 15 years in accounting. Ms. Brunner, welcome. Ms. Rosanna Morey is a small property owner living in Seaford, New York. She is joining us, I believe, from either her home or her office in New York. Welcome, Ms. Morey. Mr. Darion Dunn is the managing partner at Atlantica Properties, a real estate investment and asset management company in the state of 2 of our members of this committee, Senator Ossoff and Senator Warnock. Mr. Dunn is also a civil engineer, I understand. And Ms. Diane Yentel is the president and CEO of the National Low-Income Housing Coalition. She was once vice president of public policy and government affairs at Enterprise Community Partners. She served as director of public housing management and occupancy division at HUD in Washington, and she is almost a regular in this committee. Ms. Yentel, welcome. Professor Desmond, if you'd begin. Thank you.
Chairman Brown, Ranking Member Toomey, members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to testify before you this morning. My name is Matthew Desmond. I'm a professor of sociology at Princeton University, where I direct the Eviction Lab, which is a research group dedicated to understanding the causes and consequences of housing instability. I come before you today gravely concerned about millions of American families brutalized by our country's painful and utterly predictable rental housing crisis. Since 1985, rent prices have exceeded income gains by 325%, Most poor renting families today spend at least half of their income on housing costs, with 1 in 4 spending over 70% of their income on shelter costs alone. Last year, rents increased faster than they ever have on record. Nationwide, median asking rent increased by 17% in a single year, but some cities saw rent increases double that. Since last March, rents have risen 30% in Orlando, 29% in Cincinnati, 22% in Dallas. This is the inflation crisis on steroids. When the price of gas goes up, we can adjust, carpooling to work. When the price of food goes up, we can adjust, eating out less. But when the cost of housing shoots up, what can families do? They often are already living in the cheapest apartments available. They can't double up with relatives because of local occupancy laws. They can't move if they want to keep their jobs and family ties and their schools, so all they can do is cut back on other necessities like healthcare and educational enrichments and food. As a direct result of the housing crisis, the United States has a much higher eviction rate than other industrialized democracies. The number of eviction filings has increased by 21% since 2000, rising to 3.6 million cases filed in an average year. Eviction is incredibly harmful to families and communities. It leads to job loss and homelessness, to depression and suicide. Babies born to mothers who experience an eviction while pregnant are significantly more likely to have adverse birth outcomes, which have been shown to have lifelong and even multi-generational effects. The evidence is in, and the evidence is clear. Eviction is not just a condition of poverty, it is a cause of poverty. Why have rents risen so aggressively? One possibility is that property owners' expenses have gone up, and to maintain a steady income, owners have to pass on rising housing costs to tenants in the form of higher rents. But this is not what the data show to be happening. Rather, in recent years, owners of multifamily properties have seen their rental revenues increase at a faster rate than their expenses. This has been especially true for properties located in low-income neighborhoods. The owners of these properties saw their rental revenues increase by 47% between 2012 and 2018. Their expenses during that time only increased by 14%. Both the private housing market and the federal government have failed to provide American families with enough affordable housing. As a result, property owners have seized the opportunity to increase rents knowing they have a captive tenant base. We need to increase the supply of affordable housing, but families need relief now, not 10 years from now when the doors open, but today. Congress could provide much needed relief by deepening investments in housing vouchers. I urge this committee to pass the Eviction Crisis Act and the Family Stability Opportunity Vouchers Act, two bipartisan sponsored bills that would help stem the bleeding. And you can extend the emergency rental assistance, which did so much to prevent an eviction spike during the pandemic. When we boost incomes for working families through government programs or economic growth, but don't address rents, income gains are often recouped by the housing market. Studies have shown that when states raise minimum wages, landlords respond by raising the rent. The implication is that investing in affordable housing isn't only necessary to stabilize families and communities, it's also essential because the success of all other economic mobility efforts depend on it. Now is not the time for inaction, for indecisiveness, or for the same old tired debates about spending. We could pay for deeper investments in housing in dozens of ways. Simply collecting unpaid federal income tax from the top 1% of households would bring in an estimated $175 billion a year. What we can no longer do is look renting families in the face, families now living in cars and garages and attics and storage sheds in the richest country on the planet, and tell those families, you know, we'd love to help you, but we just can't afford it, because that is a lie.
Thank you, Professor. Ms. Brunner, welcome.
Chairman Brown, Ranking Member Toomey, members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to testify today on how renters and communities are impacted by today's housing market and how institutional investors are changing the landscape of single-family housing in Hamilton County. My name is Laura Brunner, President and CEO of the Port of Greater Cincinnati Development Authority. The Port is a public, quasi-governmental agency focused on mending broken real estate to promote job creation, home ownership, and equitable development. Our work is guided by the belief that real estate should work for everyone. We focus on the acquisition and rehabilitation of blighted residential and commercial properties to provide housing options across multiple price points, resulting in the revitalization of neighborhoods. The Port operates the Hamilton County Land Bank, whose mission is to return vacant properties back to productive use. Since 2012, we have successfully sold more than 1,000 properties. Since 2015, the Port's residential program has created more than 100 new and renovated market-rate and affordable homes, investing $24 million to catalyze private investment. Housing development is not simply a byproduct of economic development, but rather an engine of economic stability and growth. Simply, homes create long-term wealth. Real estate is one of the fastest ways to shrink the wealth gap and to help restore the middle class. In Cincinnati, Black home ownership is only 33%. Nationally, about 42% of Black households own their home compared to 72% of white households. Housing and home ownership are the foundation of everything else in our lives, and for too long, redlining and segregation has stifled Black residents from this opportunity. This has become increasingly hard today as institutional investors continue to crowd out the housing market across the country. Last summer, we asked the City of Cincinnati for the names of the 5 worst landlords. It took months of rigorous research to uncover that over 4,000 single-family homes in Hamilton County had been purchased by these 5 landlords. Tracking the acquisitions was an arduous task due to the high volume of LLCs used. There is a theme out there: out-of-town investors hiding behind a cloak of anonymity. As evidenced by the City of Cincinnati's lawsuit against Feinbrook last year, this type of investor model results in poorly maintained properties and negligent landlord practices. Investor landlords are also more likely to evict their tenants. Institutional investors may only own 1% of single-family homes, but this may mean 50% of homes on a single street. When the geographical impact is so concentrated, it has a negative, game-changing effect on what it means to live in a neighborhood. It has an impact on neighboring homes where surrounding property values see downward pressure. Institutional investors found a very profitable new sector. They have been purchasing large volumes of single-family homes in the region's most disinvested neighborhoods and turning them into rental properties. They make all-cash offers and box out first-time and low-income buyers. Our low home values and high rental rates make our city attractive. It's a cash cow for investors, but a money pit for renters. In the second quarter of 2021, 1 in 6 home sales were purchased by large investors, and we know that is significantly higher at price points below $250,000. Just last month, Cincinnati had the largest jump in rental prices in the country, so we feel we had to do something to insulate renters. In December 2021, the Port placed a bid on 194 single-family homes formerly owned by a California-based firm that fell into receivership. The receiver reached out to the Port when the auction of the properties was imminent. We couldn't help but see this opportunity as a partial antidote to the threat. In January 2022, the Port closed on this acquisition and launched the Care Homes Initiative. No other institution, to our knowledge, has taken on a project similar in scope and challenge to this acquisition. Because of our risk tolerance, we were able to create an innovative financing model that included 0 public subsidy. The Port leveraged its non-tax revenue to issue bonds to pay $14.5 million, outbidding more than a dozen investors. The Port's intent with the Care Homes Initiative is to create viable pathways to home ownership for current tenants of these homes. Working in Neighborhoods, a nonprofit with a successful track record, provides assessment, financial literacy training, and home buyer education for all interested tenants as they take this step to buy their new homes. Of course, bold ideas rarely come without risk. It's clear that some of these homes have not been touched or upgraded since they were built in the 1950s. Balancing the financial performance needs of the homes with the human needs of tenants is challenging. This reality reinforces the significance of the Port's efforts to interrupt the cycle of predatory investor ownership of these properties. It is our duty to make real estate work for our community, particularly our most vulnerable residents. Now more than ever, bold policies and leaders are needed to ensure that housing markets meet the needs of our communities. Thank you for the opportunity to testify.
Thank you, Ms. Brunner. Ms. Morey, you are recognized from New York.
Thank you. And thank you for the invitation to testify today and for the opportunity to share my story. My name is Rosanna Morey. I live on Long Island in New York, and I'm a small landlord of an owner-occupied home with a rental unit. I'm a single mom with an incurable cancer that progressed before the pandemic began. I rented the apartment in my home on a month-to-month lease to help with bills and to ease the burden on my life. As my health declined, I saw no other option but to speak to the tenant and provide notice for her to vacate so that my sister could stay with me and help me with my teenage son, who has learning disabilities. The tenant refused, and so began holdover filings and proceedings. The pandemic hit, and the eviction moratorium was put in place, which, by the way, was originally intended only for non-payment and COVID-related hardship cases. But somehow all cases were lumped together, and it did not take long for the tenant to stop paying rent. Because I effing can, and you can thank your governor for that, was the response that she gave a police officer when he asked why she continued to stay. I had to work 3 jobs while undergoing treatments to make ends meet. She spitefully and incessantly smoked, knowing that I was sick and that it made me violently ill. She violated the lease, which clearly prohibited smoking because my son was asthmatic. She didn't care, and there was nothing I could do. The stress of all of this even contributed to my having a TIA, or a mini stroke. I could go on with countless stories of deplorable behavior. Thanks to Governor Hochul's and the federal eviction moratorium extensions, this tenant was basically given the right to abuse the situation. She was allowed to live rent-free for 2 years, even though gainfully employed. She ignored any and all rules outlined in a binding lease agreement that she signed and agreed to, and the situation allowed her to destroy my property knowing that there would be no recourse. I was one of the very, very lucky people who received money from the Landlord Rental Assistance Program, or LRAP. That was New York's emergency rental assistance program for landlords whose tenants were unwilling to apply for federal emergency rental assistance. However, it was only 1 year's rent that I had to pay income taxes on, but the tenant was not required to pay taxes on the forgiven debt. The money from LRAP did not cover the entire back rent, nor the $10,000 in legal fees, nor the $25,000 it ended up costing me to rebuild and clean the area that she destroyed, even leaving feces everywhere and rotting food in the kitchen. The overall aftermath and any new regulations that landlords would be subjected to will continue to drive them away from renting out properties. Policies such as the eviction moratorium led to abuse, as in my case and many others, and has caused a 2-year backlog in court. This has contributed to the housing shortage because landlords are still housing non-paying tenants while waiting for their due process. ERAP and LRAP also did not really help landlords because a tenant that expects the government to pay will simply not pay their own rent. This perpetuates a who cares attitude and impacts landlords' livelihood. And worse yet, permanently creates an emergency rental assistance program that just makes it easier for government officials to reimpose an eviction moratorium or lockdown orders, something we all can agree is bad. The eviction moratorium that occurred during COVID led to government interference beyond what should have been allowed. The government should not discourage landlord participation, as that will just drive them away and make housing more expensive for all. With too many restrictions, affordable housing providers like myself will reconsider renting going forward. Some will just sell and leave. Some will put more stringent requirements and tenant screening criteria in place. And some will just raise the rents to cover themselves just in case. We are already starting to see the impact of all of this as social media videos have begun to circulate, teaching prospective tenants how to create fake W-2s and bank statements, etc., because so many chose not to pay rent that they now cannot provide the documentation required for a new apartment. And this cannot continue. Landlords are not in the business of evicting, but we should be able to in certain circumstances. Today, I am asking policymakers to consider landlords, particularly small mom and pop landlords and single parent landlords trying to make ends meet, and sick landlords like myself, just trying to get by. Because after all, we have families to support too. I thank you, and I look forward to answering your questions.
Thank you, Ms. Morey. Next witness is Mr. Dunn. Welcome.
Thank you. Chairman Brown, Ranking Member Toomey, and members of the committee, good morning. Thank you for the invitation to testify today and share my story. My name is Darion Dunn. I'm the managing partner of Atlantica Properties, a company that I started with my younger brother and business partner, Trenton Dunn. Atlantica Properties is a real estate investment and development firm with a mission to empower individuals by establishing thriving, holistic communities. I was born and raised in Atlanta, Georgia, by parents who taught me that home is more than a place, it is an ideal. I graduated from Georgia Tech, where I studied civil engineering and economics. I've dedicated my life's work to creating and preserving affordable housing. After acquiring my first rental property over 20 years ago, I have since participated in the ownership, management, and development of nearly 1,000 housing units. I know that expanding affordable housing in our nation is possible and critical to solving our housing affordability challenges, but the government at all levels must empower, not restrict housing providers from doing what they do best, providing places to call home for our residents at all income levels. My company is able to offer affordable rents in part because we have a thoughtful, long-term approach to property ownership. We have owned many of our rental properties for over a decade, while nearby properties have traded hands upwards of 5 times in the same period. I'm fortunate to have built a successful real estate company that operates on an institutional level, yet I've never forgotten my humble beginnings as a landlord with very limited resources. I saved money from my day jobs for the down payment for single-family rental homes and apartment properties. It's not surprising that the majority of rental homes and small multifamily properties in this country are owned by individuals and small businesses like mine. In fact, over 70% of tenants in the United States live in properties that have 20 units or less, including single-family homes. Small landlords represent a majority of the rental property industry, but policymakers tend to overlook the contributions and struggles of this group of business owners. My responsibility to our residents includes keeping my business viable so I can continue to serve those that are most vulnerable to the ever-worsening affordability crisis. Government should seek to help me do that. Our tenants are our partners, and our business cannot exist without them. The symbiotic relationship between tenants and landlords was put on full display during the height of the COVID pandemic. The financial pain felt by tenants was ultimately felt by landlords, and vice versa. Fortunately, my company didn't have a large percentage of delinquent tenants during the pandemic, like many others in my industry. However, we did have tenants that were unable or unwilling to pay rent for extended periods of time, with the worst case being a current tenant that hasn't paid rent since October 2020. While we have fortunately been able to withstand these challenges, the majority of small landlords can't sustain these types of setbacks. Emergency rental assistance programs have been a welcomed safety net, although many housing providers experience significant delays in receiving these funds due to challenges with the local execution of the program. Despite federal resources to help during the pandemic, the inventory of affordable housing is eroding as small landlords opt to or are forced to sell their properties. With supply already outstripped by demand, we cannot afford to lose these market players. We need more mission-driven housing providers. So I support business practices and public policies that strengthen the tenant-landlord bond, as opposed to those measures that pit one side against the other. Examples of good measures include lease insurance to cover property damage and lost revenue, reform of the Section 8 program, incentives to encourage housing preservation and conversion of unused commercial property to housing, and access to favorable debt and equity for non-LIHTC deals. Evictions are a last resort, but we must ensure that moratoriums don't discourage vulnerable populations from paying their rent and building their credit. For example, our company doubled down on tenant financial literacy training during the pandemic. We educated tenants on the importance of avoiding eviction filings and creditor collections. We also implemented a program to report positive rent payments to the credit bureaus, which led to 75% of our tenants improving their credit scores. I will close by reiterating that we must increase housing supply and provide incentives to strengthen the tenant-landlord relationship. There is still time to restore the legacy of affordable housing in America, and I promise to continue my efforts to make the ideal of home a reality for generations to come. Thank you for the opportunity to be here today. I look forward to answering any questions.
Thank you, Mr. Dunn. Ms. Yentel, welcome. You're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Brown, Ranking Member Toomey, and members of the committee. Thank you for the opportunity to testify today. Pre-pandemic, millions of extremely low-income households, disproportionately people of color, struggled to remain housed, and more than 500,000 people experienced homelessness. 10 million of the lowest income households paid at least half of their limited income on rent, leaving them without resources to put food on the table, purchase needed medications, or otherwise make ends meet. Any financial shock would cause them to fall behind on rent and face eviction, and in the worst cases, become homeless. These same households lost wages, had increased costs, and were at risk of losing their homes during the pandemic. The federal government responded to the clear and growing need by providing unprecedented resources and protections. Congress provided $46 billion in emergency rental assistance. President Trump implemented a national eviction moratorium, which was extended by a bipartisan Congress and further extended by President Biden. These resources and protections kept millions of renters who otherwise would have lost their homes during a global pandemic stably housed. Now, as resources are depleted and protections expire, low-income renters are faced with rising inflation, skyrocketing rents, eviction filing rates that are reaching or surpassing pre-pandemic averages, and in many communities, increasing homelessness. Every $100 increase in median monthly rent is associated with a 9% increase in homelessness. Last year, monthly rents increased on average nationally by nearly $200. Rising rents are driven by increased demand, limited supply, and a mostly unregulated market that allows landlords to raise rents without regard to the impact on tenants. Institutional investors are purchasing homes at an increasing rate, and they are raising rents, charging higher fees as a profit-making strategy, and filing for eviction at alarming rates. A lack of national renter protections places tenants at risk of unjust treatment, housing instability, and evictions. Underlying all these challenges is a long-standing, pervasive, and severe shortage of 7 million homes affordable and available to the lowest income people, which the private market on its own cannot adequately address. The shortage is a structural feature of the country's housing system, impacting every state and nearly every community. Yet Congress only funds housing assistance for 1 in 4 eligible households and has failed to preserve our country's limited supply of public and other deeply affordable housing. To address a decades-long housing crisis that has only worsened during COVID-19, Congress must enact long-term solutions, such as expanding rental assistance for all eligible households in need, preserving and expanding the supply of deeply affordable homes, providing short-term assistance to prevent evictions and homelessness, strengthening and enforcing renter protections, and incentivizing or requiring local governments to eliminate restrictive local zoning. These solutions must be paired with reforms to break down barriers that prevent access to critical resources and that deepen racial disparities. Although the best opportunity to advance long-term solutions is the reconciliation bill moving through the Senate now, it looks unlikely that the bill will address the housing crisis in any meaningful way, leaving renters and people experiencing homelessness to suffer from continued inaction. So as champions like Chairman Brown and others on the committee continue working towards long-term solutions in Congress, the Biden administration must take immediate action to protect tenants from exorbitant rent hikes and prevent more homelessness. The bottom line is this: the country's lowest income seniors, people with disabilities, and working families are struggling to stay housed in this housing market. Without decisive and quick action by the Biden administration and Congress, too many more renters will fall into homelessness, with all its associated costs to children, families, communities, and the country. We can prevent this outcome, but only if we act, and act soon. Thank you again for the opportunity.
Thank you, Ms. Yentel. Ms. Brunner, your story of the Care Homes Initiative is it's quite a story. Thank you for sharing that. And you suggested, just the arduousness, the difficulty of making that happen. Thank you for your commitment to do that. Let's talk for a moment, if you would, what other areas in Ohio are seeing similar. I don't expect you to know the details that you know in Cincinnati, of course, but are seeing big investors come in, and more importantly, what would help the port and other organizations like it be able to fix up more homes and keep them affordable for renters, or return them to affordable home ownership? Talk that through, if you would.
Thank you for the question, Mr. Chairman. We became aware of this issue about a year ago when there's an article in the Wall Street Journal that featured Cleveland, Ohio, and the rapid increase of ownership by these institutional investors there, and that's what made us start to study what was happening here in Cincinnati. I think Ohio in general is typical of a target area because of our home values relative to the rental market. So I don't have any specific information, but I know this is something that's happening throughout Ohio. And yes, the LLCs, when we got the names of 5 different investors that had the most significant code violations from the city of Cincinnati, and then went to figure out how many homes they owned in our county, you can't look up the entity name because it's common in real estate that LLCs are used for real estate ownership. But we did find that one particular investor had 91 LLCs just in our county. So that means there's this lack of transparency, which makes accountability harder. And that's one of the changes that we would recommend, is that there's some kind of registration process that would make it easier for the local jurisdictions to then track and hold accountable these property owners for the condition of the properties. And we also discovered that many of them are still receiving homeownership credits on their property tax bills. So that's something else that should be changed. And we certainly don't want to have less costs for them than other businesses, because what they're doing is, these are businesses, so they should pay higher taxes. And I also think that we're looking into 2 other ideas. We don't know to the extent to which opportunity zone funding has been used for the investment in these properties. We know that a very significant amount of the investment is in low census tract areas. So it would be a concern, certainly, if opportunity zone funding is used for this, which is, I think, not the intent. And I think there needs to be some analysis of REIT taxation and the implications that has for this asset class.
Thanks, Ms. Brunner. Professor Desmond, 2 questions, if you'd kind of answer them together. First, addressing what Ms. Brunner said about LLCs and tell us how it's affected your ability to track who's filing evictions around the country, because I know that's a big part of the work you're doing at the Eviction Lab. And then if you would also speak for a moment about the Eviction Crisis Act, how it helps us better understand and prevent evictions.
Thank you, Chairman Brown. The growth of LLCs in the rental housing market has expanded precipitously over the years. Studies have linked LLC ownership to property neglect. This isn't because landlords who register under LLCs own older stock. It seems to be LLCs invite moral hazard. What prevents liability also seems to prevent accountability and can invite negligent behavior. Studies have also linked LLC ownership to property disinvestment, tax abandonment, even completely walking away from properties. One of the landlords I spent time with in Milwaukee, I asked her, what happened to this house that I spent a lot of time with? And she said, I just gave it back to the city. And what she meant was she just stopped paying taxes on it, let it go into tax foreclosure. Tax foreclosure should not be part of a business strategy, but for some landlords that use LLCs, it is. It is also the case that it seems to be the case that small number of landlords do an outsized number of evicting. Now, we can't know who exactly those people are because we don't know who owns our cities. If we did, we could design policies that would target the root of the eviction crisis. The Eviction Crisis Act would do a lot to get us to a better place when it comes to stemming evictions. First, it would allow us to track eviction data, which is the only way to understand if evictions are, for example, violating the Fair Housing Act. The federal government doesn't collect eviction data. The only group that does is my group at Princeton on a national level, and I promise you I will not do this forever. The second thing the Eviction Crisis Act does is look at legal reform and inside the courts and see if we can make a more humane and rational way to adjudicate the process. And third, it looks at rental assistance. And if we could figure out a way to make small dollars go a long way. For example, in Cincinnati last year, I believe 1 in 7 evictions were for less than $500. So for some cases, the line between homelessness and staying in your home doesn't cost that much money.
Thank you. Ms. Yentel, your comments on that, what the Eviction Crisis Act would do in your view?
I would point primarily to the last piece that Matt mentioned, making emergency rental assistance a permanent program and permanently funding it at $3 billion annually. The legislation was initially introduced as bipartisan legislation in the Senate in 2019. Even before the pandemic, there was bipartisan understanding and agreement that short-term rental assistance could help some families who can otherwise make ends meet absorb an unexpected financial shock and avoid eviction and the spiraling into poverty that results. It was initially envisioned as a pilot program, and then, of course, 2020 came, the pandemic, $46 billion in emergency rental assistance. We've had our pilot program. Emergency rental assistance has been successful. 40 billion of the 46 billion has been spent or obligated. 6 million families have been helped. Over 6 million payments have been made. So now it's time to take all the lessons that we learned during the pandemic from the 500 programs that were stood up across the country and put that into authorization and funding for a permanent emergency rental assistance. And again, really pleased to see that the legislation is bipartisan and does have bipartisan support.
Thank you, Senator Toomey.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Morey, thank you for being with us remotely today. I appreciate your testimony. I feel badly for the circumstances you're in. I certainly hope your prognosis is good and that you're feeling well. I read your testimony, so I know the story, but we did not have a good audio connection for much of your opening comments. So I just want to clarify a few things for people who might not have been able to understand what you were saying. First of all, my understanding is you own your own home, and attached or as part of that home, there's an apartment, and that you rented that apartment out on a month-to-month lease to a tenant, right?
That is correct.
Right. And then at some point, because of a deterioration in your health, you decided that you really needed to have your sister move into that apartment who could help you. And so you provided the notice to your tenant that you at some point would not continue to renew the lease, and your tenant nevertheless refused to leave the apartment. Is that right?
That is correct.
And did I understand you to say that she stayed in the apartment without paying at least the full rent, maybe, I don't know if she paid any rent, for 2 years?
Close to.
Close to 2 years. She stayed in the apartment, and you couldn't do anything about that. Why?
Because housing closed. And even when I tried to open a different case because of her smoking, so more of an emergency type of hearing or filing, that was going to start the clock over again, meaning that my last filing would go away and the new filing would then take its place.
And with an eviction moratorium in place, would you be able to evict this person?
Yes. If there was no eviction moratorium in place, if I heard you correctly, yes, that is correct.
Right. If there was no eviction moratorium, then you could. If there is an eviction moratorium, then you wouldn't. Did this person seem to know that you were not in a position to be able to evict her?
Yes.
And so took advantage of that. And so let me ask you, now, having gone through this experience and knowing what you know about the government's willingness, certainly at times, to impose a ban on evictions, do you regret having rented your place out?
I don't regret it, but a guarantee of no moratorium, there would have to be more than that. I would have to feel supported and protected by my government. There would have to be protections for risk mitigation laws that don't just favor one side in order for me to ever consider renting again.
Right. We've been hearing a lot about the supply of housing. It's true. We have a shortage. And this is, to me, a very compelling story of the unintended consequence of what's meant to be helpful to tenants, but actually becomes very harmful when some people inevitably abuse this. Mr. Dunn, in your testimony, you said, and I quote, "Government actions that raise my costs ultimately impact my residents and my ability to provide affordable housing," end quote. So I assume that, like any other business, if there are higher costs imposed on you from the outside at some point, you've got to pass that on to your customers, the renters, whether it's in higher rent or a higher security deposit or some combination thereof. If higher costs are imposed on you, are you going to have to impose those costs ultimately on renters?
Generally, that is the case.
Right.
There's a misconception that landlords are mostly big business, and as we've heard today, that over 70% of landlords are small business.
Yeah, I do want to get to a point about that.
And also those costs have to be passed on because there's such relatively small margins,
right,
like in any business. I mean, some businesses have less than 10% of a cash flow margin and up to maybe 20 or 30%. So if costs are raised by maybe even 10 or 20%, that could absolutely wipe out any profit
right.
potential.
So it has to get passed on. Yeah. So a cost such as, higher tax or a higher maintenance cost on your building is an obvious one. But there's another kind of cost, which would be if the government imposes an eviction moratorium that has the effect that some percentage of rent is not going to be collected because people know that you have no recourse if they don't pay the rent. So most people will still continue to pay their rent on time because they know it's the right thing to do, and they will.
Right.
But there will be some percentage that will choose not to.
Right.
And so knowing that, if you're living under an eviction moratorium where the government is imposing that cost in the form of a lost revenue, don't most landlords have to pass that on in the form of a higher rent to people who are paying their rent?
The moratoriums can threaten the relationship between tenants and landlords. Most tenants, as you said, they pay their rent. They're responsible.
Sure.
But when you have a system that doesn't protect the other side of the partnership, and you'll often hear me use that word partnership, it's not about the tenant, it's not about the landlord, it's about the tenant-landlord partnership. And when one side of that partnership is not protected, it hurts the entire system. So when you have a moratorium in place that doesn't allow one side of the partnership to thrive, that entire system breaks down.
And the cost is going to have to be borne by people who are paying. Last point I want to make. It's come up repeatedly from witnesses, and my colleagues have made the point about increasing percentage of single-family homes, especially, that are owned by private investors. And there's a lot of people very concerned about that. I would just underscore that the people who are most able to afford the burden, the costs of ever more regulations, are large corporations that can spread that out in a big legal department as opposed to the mom and pop tenant. And by the way, we tolerate the GSEs subsidizing the financing of private investors in these single family homes. If people would prefer to have local landlords and people owning their own homes, one thing we could do is forbid the GSEs from engaging in these subsidies. I would urge my Democratic colleagues to consider that. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Toomey. Senator Menendez of New Jersey is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Yentel, the National Low Income Housing Coalition's Out of Reach report shows in stark detail just how hard it is for low-income renters to afford even modest housing. In my home state of New Jersey, a medium-income renter is barely able to pay for a one-bedroom home. A renter earning minimum wage would need to work 80 hours a week or 2 full-time jobs to afford a one-bedroom house. However, the data is actually even worse than that because affordable housing availability impacts other parts of a family's budget. For example, affordable housing is increasingly located in areas that are far away from job centers, forcing workers to pay higher transportation costs. Given this, how important is it that we build more affordable housing near public transit so that we can connect people to good-paying jobs and careers and opportunities?
Thank you for the question, Senator Menendez. It is important that Congress not only invest in more deeply affordable homes for the lowest income people, but also to ensure that low-income, extremely low-income people and people of color can live near transportation and the opportunities that that presents for them. We also have to be careful when we work on transit-oriented development to ensure that it doesn't create displacement or gentrification. And the affordable housing component of TOD is the best way to do that, to ensure that we are preserving existing affordable housing in neighborhoods connected to transportation and building more so that the lowest income people aren't displaced if new development comes near those transit stations.
Thank you. That's why I led the charge of my Livable Communities Act, which creates a federal grant program to incentivize the development of new affordable housing near existing mass transit. We hope to see some of that happen. By the way, my preface to the question, you don't dispute any of what I said in terms of the realities of where it is for rental incomes in terms of people's challenge to meet that.
Absolutely. Rents are far out of reach certainly for minimum wage workers, other low wage workers, for seniors, people with disabilities on extremely limited fixed incomes. But we also find that rents are far out of reach even for the average renter, who often earns about $5 to $6 less an hour than what rent costs in their communities. So a big part of the housing crisis that we are facing today is stagnant or declining wages for the lowest income people and skyrocketing rents that they can't afford.
And when people can't find a place to call home, and they're displaced, then society bears the burden. Talk about who bears the burden.
Oh, absolutely. Inaction is expensive. As a country, we pay to allow for homelessness and housing poverty to persist, and we pay for it through increased healthcare costs for families and parents. We pay for it through lessened educational attainment for kids. Families that are unaffordably housed or precariously housed earn less over their lifetimes. They pay less in taxes. So the flip of that is also true. When we invest in affordable housing, there are savings to be found in many other areas of our life and throughout the federal government.
Thank you. Professor Desmond, the coronavirus brought unprecedented challenges to all of us, including renters across America, many who were already struggling prior to the pandemic. However, with the CARES Act eviction moratorium and the emergency rental assistance funding provided by the Consolidated Appropriations Act and the American Rescue Plan, we were able to keep millions of people from being evicted. What has the Eviction Lab's data shown about how these programs help renters stay in their homes?
Both programs were historic and incredibly successful. Between the end of the CDC's eviction moratorium and July, roughly 216,000 evictions that would be expected under normal conditions did not happen. The biggest reductions in evictions were seen in low-income African American and Hispanic communities, areas mostly affected by the eviction crisis. At the same time, during the days, I should say, that the moratorium existed, foreclosures were down historically in the country too, because the federal government also rolled out forbearance for homeowners. And so this was a policy that was one of the most important federal policies in the lives of low-income renters since the invention of public housing.
And finally, what lessons can we learn from the pandemic with regards to targeted housing assistance programs to the communities that need it most to ensure funding is deployed as rapidly and efficiently as possible?
One of the consequences of the Emergency Rental Assistance Program is the development of channels in every state to get money in the hands of tenants that need it and a way to make property owners whole. It would be a waste to let those channels go by the wayside since we've built them through the pandemic.
Thank you. I understand Senator Kramer is next.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member. Thanks to all of our witnesses for being here. Mr. Dunn, I think it seems we pretty much can all agree to some degree on the problem. I will tell you, in listening to Senator Toomey's questioning, my mind started going down the usual path of what is the ultimate end to the constant government distortion of markets, the sticks and the carrots that seem to just create a higher price and very little in regards to providing more supply. I mean, the biggest problem with inflation, the cause of inflation, is when demand outpaces supply. So we keep incenting demand and don't do enough, in my view, to incentivize supply. And I'm not really sure where it all ends. But one part of that scenario that we don't talk about enough is the cost of regulation. And there's been a study I'm sure you're familiar with recently that predicts about 40% of the cost of multifamily and single-family rent is regulation. Can you speak a little bit to government regulation? And again, I am sincere when I say I think we struggle to find the balance. Every time we try to solve a problem, we incentivize one side or the other, and all we do is escalate costs. Can you speak a little bit to that imbalance and what's the right balance, if you have a sense of what that might be?
Yes, Senator Kramer, and you're correct. The National Home Builders Association, they did do a study, and looking at all levels of government, regulation adds about 40% to the cost of building homes and to the cost of building real estate and developing real estate, and that is directly passed on to the very people we're trying to help. So we have to make sure that we're dealing with the root cause of the issue, which is a lack of supply. And everyone, even every witness here today, we agree that that is the problem. Mm-hmm. And we need to focus our efforts and focus our dollars on every level of government, local, state, and federal level, on making sure we're creating more housing. And when we create solutions that, in many cases, I even understand why they're being created in the short term to help one side, it doesn't help the problem. And it doesn't solve the problem that we need more housing. We have to make sure there's plans that create more units and not initiatives that pit one side against the other. We have to make sure that tenant-landlord bond, which is sacred, is, has a place to live in this country.
Sure. And you don't advocate, I don't think any of us advocate no regulations. Obviously, there needs to be protections put in place. But I agree. Honestly, the problem is easier to identify than the solution, I readily admit. I mean, when the incentives create a distortion to the point where the cost of rent is going up faster than the rest of the economy, that's not the right solution. But I'm kind of with you. I'd like to see us focus more on the supply side, but I'm not sure that completely does it either, because sometimes you can end up with just an overabundance of that as well. But anyway, with that, thank you all for, and by the way, I mean, I still have a minute and a half. If anybody else wants to comment on the same question, either from a different perspective, I'd be happy to listen.
Well, I'd be happy to share that related to regulations or state and local laws, that one of the biggest challenges to increasing affordable housing supply is often restrictive local zoning that inhibits the supply of any kind of apartments, and especially affordable apartments. Mm-hmm. And this drives up costs for everybody, and it exacerbates segregation and other racial disparities. So states and localities will need to do more to limit or entirely remove those restrictive zoning laws if we're to be able to build the number of homes that the country needs. And the federal government can use the levers that it has, primarily in creating incentives or requirements that are tied to federal funding, especially the big pots of funding through the bipartisan transportation infrastructure bill. That can create a very compelling incentive for local communities if they are able to receive those funds only if they do more at the local level to reduce restrictive zoning.
The only thing that concerns me about that is that that sounds swell until the local community decides it's not worth the funding, in which case you've solved no problem.
Well, that's why we should think bigger than the housing funds, where typically we do look at incentives for restrictive zoning, and we should look to the much bigger pots of money that all communities want related to transportation funds, highways, et cetera.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Ready? Thank you, Senator Kramer. Senator Reed from Rhode Island is recognized.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Professor Desmond, what we've noticed is that a lot of institutional investors, private equity firms, et cetera, have been getting into buying residential homes with significant numbers, and that could disrupt the entire market. I know real estate is typically a really local issue in terms of realtors, in terms of individual sales, in terms of all those factors. So do you have an assessment yet as to why they're getting in, what they might do, and what are the downsides?
Thank you, Senator Reed. So we've seen the rise of institutional investors in the single-family rental market after the 2008 foreclosure crisis because there was a market opportunity. The average cost of a home dropped by 27% after the foreclosure, but rents did not decrease during the last recession. That gave institutional investors a chance to buy up single-family homes below market rent and rent them at market rents. And that's why you've seen increasing investment in Sunbelt cities like Atlanta, Charlotte, Phoenix, for example, where institutional investors have a bigger chunk of the market. Nationwide, it seems that about 2.3% of the single-family rental market is now owned by institutional investors, but even that relatively small footprint is much bigger in places like Atlanta, where in some neighborhoods a third of the rental family market, the single-family market is owned by institutional investors. Why should this concern us? Because research has linked institutional investment to higher housing costs. Institutional investors raise rents much more aggressively than small-time landlords. There's also research linking institutional investors to property neglect, putting more onus on tenants for upkeep, and also they evict at much higher rates for much lower amounts of money.
Oh, thank you very much. And the other issue, recalling my service here in 08, 09, and 10, is that are we seeing these institutional investors taking the ownership and then creating derivatives or other financial products based on their ownership? Is that happening?
I'm not sure how to answer that question at this time.
Okay, very good. And both Ms. Yentel and Professor Desmond, what kinds of federal investments in housing supply would be the most effective to ease family housing costs and help renters? Any thoughts? Let's start with Professor Desmond and then Ms. Yentel.
Sure. So the Housing Choice Voucher Program has been an incredibly effective program. Families, after they receive a housing voucher, move to better neighborhoods. Their kids do better in schools. Their kids literally eat more and become healthier and less anemic. So an incredibly cost-effective, successful way to expand more housing security, more economic mobility of families across the country is simply to take a program that we have that already works really well and expand it to all the families that need it.
Ms. Yentel, your comments?
Absolutely agree, and would add when it comes to housing supply, our country's newest and most deeply targeted housing supply program is the National Housing Trust Fund, thanks to your leadership in creating and getting it enacted. The program at its current funding level, 100% of those dollars are to build or preserve apartments affordable to extremely low-income households. And many of those apartments are up and running now, housing some of the most marginalized, vulnerable people in our country, including people who are previously chronically homelessness, foster care, kids who are aging out of foster care, survivors of domestic violence, and so on. The only problem with the program is that it's woefully underfunded, given the need. This year was its largest funding level yet, and it's still at under $1 billion for the entire country. So that program needs to be significantly expanded so that we can build the number of homes that are needed and ensure that they are affordable to the people with the greatest and the clearest needs, which is extremely low-income renters.
This shall come as no surprise, but I completely agree with you. Our challenge is to come up with the funding sources to keep the Housing Trust Fund very, very active and going forward. With that, Mr. Chairman, I will thank you and thank the panel. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Senator Reed. Senator Tester is from Montana is recognized from his office.
Yeah, thank you, Chairman Brown. Thank you for having the hearing. Look, I come from Montana, and many Montanans have had trouble finding available housing. Same way across the country. The price points have gotten too high. It has gotten worse during the pandemic because so many people think that the entire state's like the show Yellowstone. And I guess that's okay, but that's really not true. And across our communities in Montana, some places are seeing median sale prices of a home rise 40% in the last year alone. This is pushing more and more people from potential home ownership to looking for homes to rent. So, Ms. Brunner, what impact do these challenges have on the ground in communities like yours?
Thank you for the question, Senator. I think that there is a profound impact on local families when home ownership opportunities are taken away from them, and an amazing impact on the neighborhoods that are replaced by institutional investors owning the properties. And if I can build on the question that was asked earlier about the motivations for these investors, one of the things that's fueled it is what Professor Desmond talked about, and obviously with the home prices crashing going back to the time of the 2008 housing crisis. And then there's been, since that time, an amazing amount of institutional money and non-recourse debt that's been available. So many of these investors have been able to buy properties without any guarantees of the debt. And the portfolio that we purchased, for example, it was in receivership, not because the portfolio failed, but because the owner just walked away. And then the judge put the properties into receivership for the protection of the investors and lenders. So there's been too much capital out there chasing places for investment. And then this product has been made, has really just been created out of whole cloth. Instead of investing in apartment buildings and office buildings and industrial buildings, all of a sudden single-family houses became the desirable sector. And there's been so much money chasing it, and the debt has been too easy to get. And then as you go back into the individual neighborhoods, when you have 4,000 houses in a community the size of Hamilton County, in every single neighborhood, it makes a difference. And we're getting calls from jurisdictions throughout the county on a regular basis asking what we can do to help them fight back.
Okay, and also in my state, a growing number of homes for rent are being converted into vacation rentals in many, many communities, which puts additional stress on already low housing supply. Ms. Yentel, are there strategies that have worked to prevent local residents from being displaced or ease the impact due to tourism? And I know it's a two-edged sword, but quite frankly, when these homes are taken off the markets because families can't afford to buy them because they're used for vacation rentals, that adds to the problem. Are there any strategies out there?
Well, sure. Anytime that rental units, and especially affordable rental units, are taken off the market and used for some other purpose than housing low-income people, that exacerbates the existing shortage of homes affordable to them in that community. So it points back to the real need to, in places where there aren't enough homes for the people who live there or want to live there, we need to build more. And to build more market rate apartments, we need local communities to remove restrictive zoning laws and allow the market to build those units and have them affordable to middle or higher income renters. For the lower and especially extremely low income renters, the private market on its own cannot build and operate apartments that are affordable to them because they can't pay enough in rent that covers the costs to build and operate the apartments. So for them, federal subsidies are needed, either in the form of, if there are an adequate number of homes and the people living in them can't afford them, in the form of rental assistance to be a bridge between what they can afford and what rent costs, or in the form of building apartments and ensuring that they are deeply affordable to extremely low-income people through programs like the National Housing Trust Fund.
Ms. Yentel, as long as you're warmed up, we don't have we don't have any immigration policy in this country, quite frankly, and we need one because it would help with the workforce. It would actually have some positive impacts on reducing inflation. But nonetheless, we're locked up on that issue in Washington, D.C., and we have an incredible paralysis. Do you have any thoughts on where we could get workforce to build these houses?
I'm sorry, I don't fully understand the question. How we could get
them? The point is, if we're going to increase supply, we've got to have workforce. We got no workforce. We've got no immigration policy, and we don't have enough folks to build houses. Do you have any thoughts on that?
That's a really important and good question. I don't have immediate solutions to share, but I would love to follow up with your office afterwards to share some.
Super. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thanks, Senator Tester. Senator Warner from Virginia is recognized from his office.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate you having this hearing. And Ms. Yentel, if you've got those solutions on workforce in terms of building the housing, let my office know as well. We are long overdue on an immigration solution. And one of the things I know I've worked with the chairman and others on is that as we think about a project that I've been involved in unsuccessfully for well over a decade in terms of Fannie and Freddie reform, the idea of having something approximating a 15 to 20 basis point fee on all of the work that Fannie and Freddie does on mortgages would create a dedicated source of funding for not only first-time home ownership, but also potentially into the National Housing Trust Fund to deal with the rental issue as well. One of the things I've worked on a lot has been home ownership, and I know we're going to. My question, Ms. Yentel, I'm going to come to you is on rental housing. Been a big advocate, along with others on this committee, on community development financial institutions, CDFIs. I'm proud of the fact that, along with Senator Crapo, a number of members on this committee, we've started a CDFI caucus in the Senate to try to make sure we get more capital into these entities that help fund through low and moderate income housing. And we've seen through COVID a disproportionate impact on communities of color. But I think we need to do that. And I think there is this virtuous circle that I know, Ms. Yentel, you've talked about as well, that providing more affordable housing, either in the rental market or in terms of even home ownership, ends up helping communities all across the income spectrum. But I want to go to you, Ms. Yentel, because your group did a recent study called The Gap, a shortage of affordable rental housing. It pointed out in a state like mine, Commonwealth of Virginia, we've got about 150,000 shortage of affordable rental housing units. One of the things, we've got certain tax programs that you, Ms. Yentel, and others have pointed out, we just don't have enough private capital going into building affordable rental housing. What can we do as a federal government beyond some of our traditional programs to incent more private capital going into this underserved market?
Well, I would actually bring it back to the public investments that are needed, especially as we talk about where the data shows the clearest and the greatest needs are. The data are very clear that the most severe shortage of homes affordable is for the lowest income people. In fact, extremely low income renters are the only segment of the population for which there is an absolute shortage of homes affordable to them. And this has ripple effects up the income ladder, and addressing this shortage can provide relief up the income ladder too. And especially when we're talking about federal resources, I think it's very important that we ensure that these limited resources are targeted where the greatest needs are. For the work that you have done on first-generation home buyers and assisting more first-generation people to become home buyers, I think that's very important, and for renters too, because all housing is on a continuum. And when we have a situation like we do today, where potential first-time or first-generation home buyers are locked out of the market because single-family home prices are so high, that keeps them in the rental market. They tend to have higher incomes than other renters. That can drive up costs. And as I've said before, our housing system is like a game of musical chairs. And when the music stops playing, it's always the lowest income people or people with no incomes who are left standing without any homes at all.
But
So
can I just ask you, but just, I mean, I understand we need this federal subsidy, but how do we get, unless we're going to do 100% federal financing, how do we take those federal incentives to incent private capital beyond kind of some of the tax credit programs to actually get us more supply of low-income rental housing? I mean, I'm just wondering if there's anything else, beyond our, should we simply fund the existing tax credit programs, or are there other examples of creative initiatives you've seen in your work that we ought to bring and put into the toolkit?
Well, we can do direct grants as we do through the National Housing Trust Fund, and that's effective for communities to be able to use those funds to build and preserve apartments affordable to the lowest income people. Tax incentives are also helpful in attracting private capital. The low-income housing tax credit is certainly a very successful program that should be expanded and reformed to ensure that communities that receive those tax credits can do more, again, to build apartments for those lowest income people.
And I just say, Mr. Chairman, I think, we all, or most of us on the committee, support the National Housing Trust Fund, but the erratic level of funding to that, one of the ideas, even though we may not have fully agreed on all the housing finance reform, the idea of at least putting some dedicated fee on those mortgages that get the government guarantee that would provide a more stable source of funding for the National Housing Trust Fund, I hope we could revisit. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thanks, Senator Warner. Senator Warren from Massachusetts is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. America's renters are struggling, and the Fed's interest rate hikes are making it both more expensive to build more housing and more expensive to take out a mortgage to buy a home. This could lock more families into the rental market and push rents even higher. Now, big Wall Street firms are watching this with dollar signs in their eyes. Private equity, real estate investment trusts, and big corporations have gobbled up more and more of the rental market and now serve as landlords to thousands and thousands of Americans. In 2018, non-individual investors owned 26% of the rental stock, up from 18% in 2001. On a recent earnings call, executives at the private equity firm Blackstone bragged that slowing housing construction, that is less supply, and higher mortgage costs, quote, provide a lot of support, end quote, for their bottom line, since, quote, people will still have to live somewhere. So, Professor Desmond, you're the leading expert on predatory housing schemes. So let me ask you, as corporate landlords like Blackstone buy up rental properties, what will be the impact on families who are in those homes?
Senator Warren, first, those families will pay more, and sometimes a lot more. Institutional investors are on record by raising the rents double digits, even in a single quarter. Those families also might experience a reduction in housing quality as institutional investors divest from housing as part of their business model. They saddle tenants with extra fines and fees, including tenants that can't make the rent at the beginning of the month just because they don't get paid on a monthly basis. Plus, those tenants are often outgunned not only politically but in court, where many of those tenants don't have access to a lawyer, but over 90% of landlords do. That leaves those families in an incredibly vulnerable situation.
Right. In fact, thanks to an investigation by the House Select Subcommittee on the Coronavirus Crisis, we know that during the height of the pandemic, corporate landlords illegally evicted families by the thousands, violating federal and state moratoriums that had been put in place to protect tenants. So today, with families struggling with these rapidly rising rents that you talked about, and with the economy at risk of being pushed into recession by the Fed's overzealous interest rate hikes, it's urgent that we take steps to protect renters from predatory schemes and ensure that corporate landlords at least follow the rules that are in place. And that's one reason I've proposed creating a new tenant protection bureau, which would allow tenants to easily file complaints against unscrupulous landlords and to provide officials with the data they need to enforce tenant protection laws. Ms. Yentel, how could a tenant protection bureau protect families' rights and force these Wall Street landlords to actually follow the rules?
It could be tremendously helpful, Senator Warren. As you said, that report only verified what we knew was happening during the pandemic, which was some of these corporate landlords were flouting the law. And we pushed throughout the pandemic for the federal government to hold them accountable, to apply the penalties to them for not following the CDC eviction moratorium. But there was no single agency that was charged with or empowered to do that, and so it didn't happen. If we had a tenant protection bureau in place during the pandemic, it could have prevented untold harm and evictions of some of the most marginalized people. And if we had it today, it could help further enforce tenant protections, prevent egregious rent hikes, and let tenants hold their landlords accountable.
Yeah, that's a very powerful answer, and I appreciate it. Look, to ensure that every family has access to safe and affordable place to live, we've got to build more housing. That is the ultimate answer. We need more supply. There's no way around it. These investments are overdue. But it is also urgent that right now we stand up to big corporate landlords and to protect tenants from these predatory schemes that could push them out on the street. And a tenant protection bureau would be a good start. So thank you very much. Thank you for your work. Thank you for being here. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Warren. Senator Van Hollen of Maryland's recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank all of you for your testimony here today. And I think there's consensus that we need to address the housing supply issue. And there may be some federal tools we can use to incentivize local jurisdictions to reduce barriers to housing supply. But I think all of us know we're not going to snap our fingers today and in the next 6 months, a year, a couple of years, create all the supply we need. So I think we should also be focused on using proven public policy tools to provide more families with affordable housing and allow families that have been trapped in poverty to move to areas of opportunity. Professor Desmond, I want to start with you because you mentioned in your written testimony a bipartisan bill that I introduced with Senator Todd Young called the Family Stability and Opportunity Vouchers Act, which would provide, families with young kids the opportunity to move to an affordable home, but also wraparound services to make transitions to other neighborhoods with higher opportunity. Could you first briefly talk about the fact that people have looked at this, the empirical evidence shows this is effective? And second, what is the impact on that program, which we're trying to expand significantly because it's been successful? What's the impact of some of the institutional investors buying up properties in some of the areas these families want to move to?
Thank you for the question, Senator. The bipartisan bill that you helped introduce and sponsor would be incredibly impactful for families in all sorts of ways. Housing is bound up with opportunity. So it's not just about how much rent you're paying, but it's also where you're living, where your kids are going to school. The promise of a housing voucher is to expand choice and opportunity for so many Americans denied it. So the empirical research on this is very clear. When families have the opportunity to move to neighborhoods with lower rates of poverty, lower rates of crime, higher rates of public safety, their lives are improved in so many different ways. Let me just give you one data point. Children who go to schools with higher levels of integration do far better than their peers who go to segregated schools, even when those segregated schools are flooded with resources. So these programs work, not to mention just giving families a breath and relief so they can pay what they should be paying for housing costs instead of driving them into poverty. The institutional investment in our markets is the opposite of this. It is the view that housing is a commodity, that it's something that should only be for profit, and it's an opportunity denier and a poverty spreader.
I appreciate that observation, which is why this trend is alarming. The other challenge we, of course, have is discrimination based on source of income, where in certain places, I think the majority of places around the country, landlords can discriminate against people with vouchers because of the source of income. Can you talk about that challenge and whether it's made even more difficult if you have an institutional investor with no connection to the neighborhood?
So source of income discrimination, as you know, is in most countries, or in most counties, there's no law against just saying no to a family just because they have a voucher. The evidence suggests that when source of income laws are put in place, they do help families get housed quicker and into better neighborhoods. There's a higher success rate with vouchers with those laws intact. With respect to institutional investors on this question, you know, when you take the landlord and tenant relationship that Mr. Dunn so eloquently talked about today, and you put a lot of distance between folks that are working together, and you make that relationship purely financial, landlords don't have a lot of skin in the game to give tenants a break when their kid gets sick or when they have to go to the dentist appointment. So it does suggest that those landlords not only are going to react in a more kind of impersonal way, it suggests that they might build in a kind of discrimination that is beneficial to their profit motive, including source of income discrimination.
Thank you. There's a whole lot of additional territory to cover. Ms. Yentel, I just have a little bit remaining time. Could you comment briefly on the Family Stability and Opportunity Vouchers Act and why it would be important to move that forward?
Well, it would be important for all the reasons Professor Desmond said. The only thing that I would add is that the legislation, 500,000 new vouchers targeted towards families with young children, could effectively end family homelessness, and that the funds that are included for mobility counseling are especially important because that allows counselors to help these families with finding communities that are best for them and then helping them obtain and retain housing in those communities. So it's a very important bill.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thanks, Senator Van Hollen. Senator Cortez Masto is recognized from her office.
Thank you. Chairman Brown, Ranking Member Toomey, I want to start also by thanking Irene Gray, our stenographer, who has served the Senate for over 27 years. Thank you for your service, and I wish you well. I also want to thank the Ranking Member and the Chairman for this important hearing. Similar to what I have heard from all of my colleagues, I too am concerned about institutional investors and the impact it is having in Nevada by we seeing all these properties being purchased. I know in my state in 2021, 29% of the homes purchased in the Las Vegas metro area were bought by investors. My challenge is I can't tell how many are institutional, and I think it has everything to do with what I heard earlier about too many LLCs, not enough transparency, and being able to track this. So, Ms. Yentel, can I ask you, because we've heard the negative impacts by some of these institutional investors. I'm not saying it's all of them, but some of them that we have had and heard in our community. Can you share some examples of communities effectively countering the pressures on home prices brought on by purchases from institutional investors?
So I would say that the challenges that low-income tenants face from institutional and other landlords is primarily based in the fact that we have few tenant protections throughout the country. And there is a tremendous power imbalance that tilts heavily in favor of landlords, especially institutional investors, at the expense of low-income renters. And so we need to rebalance that power so it's more equal, and tenants have protections against exorbitant rent hikes, against these kind of fees for profit strategies, and against the increased evictions. And there's a whole set of tenant protections that should be implemented at the federal, state, and local level.
Well, let me ask you this as we talk about finding that balance, because I do think it is important. We were talking about vouchers and the positive impact it does have for stability for tenants. But can you talk a little bit about what vouchers also does and brings to property managers and the benefits as well?
Sure. It's reliable income for property owners, for landlords. If they have a tenant who has a Section 8 voucher, then they will get regular rent paid each month, and they have the benefit of knowing that that rent will be stable and will be continuous. So it's a benefit for landlords as well.
And it also gives them the ability to prepare for and help them upkeep their property as well. Is that right?
Well, the rents are pegged at the fair market rate, which should be enough for landlords to be able to operate and maintain their properties.
Let me jump to Professor Desmond, because you included manufactured home communities in your book, Evicted. And thank you so much for the work that you provided in Evicted. Very enlightening. Can I ask you this? The other area I'm concerned about is manufactured homes being purchased by private equity as well, and the impact that we are seeing that also on the security and stability of the tenants. Can you talk a little bit about how what you're seeing there as well with respect to our manufactured home communities? It's the first time I've heard so many in my state that are now losing their stability, losing their homes, and these private equity companies are coming in and purchasing up all of these communities.
Senator, I think your concern is warranted. What we've seen is institutional investors buying up manufacturing housing, which serves an enormous source of housing for low-income Americans, and often evicting entire mobile home parks and displacing entire communities. Let me just give you one example of how institutional investing is different also than just normal landlording. So only about 5% of Americans are paid on a monthly basis right now, but rent comes due at the beginning of the month. So for that 95% of Americans, often they can't make rent during the first of the month. So if you have an institutional investor as your landlord, you often get just an eviction notice by computer or by algorithm. And you pay to stay, you pay the late fees and the eviction fines to stay. But by our estimate, that increases your housing cost by 20%, which means the rental housing crisis, as scary as it is on paper, is even worse if you're under those kind of conditions.
Thank you. I notice my time is up. Thank you again.
Thank you, Senator Cortez Masto. Senator Smith of Minnesota is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And thanks so much to all of our testifiers for being here today. It's extremely helpful. So 2 weeks ago in the Housing Subcommittee that I chair, we held a hearing on homelessness and how we can work together to address this important issue. And as the chair knows, Senator Rounds, my ranking member, and Chair Brown, and many subcommittee members were participating in that. It was very helpful. And it's directly connected to this hearing today, right? Because we know that without a safe, affordable place to live, nothing in your life works. And at our subcommittee, all of our witnesses agreed that the primary cause of homelessness is, again, this deep undersupply of affordable housing. And I think we're obviously seeing in this committee hearing today that this housing supply problem affects all segments of the housing continuum. And we're seeing how these shortages are affecting the rental housing market, the home ownership market, and it's a big deal in rural and suburban and urban communities as well. So I want to come first to Dr. Desmond with this, thinking about this backdrop of the hearing a couple of weeks ago on homelessness. What do you see as the relationship between homelessness and the broader problem of housing affordability. How do we, I mean, could you just talk a bit more about that homelessness issue?
Certainly, Senator, as Ms. Yentel offered in her comments, when the rent goes up, so does homelessness. There's a direct connection between rental costs rising and shelter capacity expanding, people moving from home they pay 50% of their income to one they pay 70%, to maybe their car, to a shelter, to the street. So there is a direct link. The reporting out of California on this has been incredibly telling. 60% of people that live on the street in Oakland are from Oakland.
Yep.
Lived in Oakland, often were homeowners in Oakland, and through one reason or another, but that come back to the housing crisis, ended up at the street as citizens and natives of that state.
And there is this misperception that people become unhoused, they become homeless because they have an underlying health problem like a substance use disorder or a mental health issue. But yet, isn't it true that those are the kinds of health issues that develop because you are experiencing homelessness?
Both can be true, but the intervention is very clear. You know, when we provide families homes first, no matter their mental health state or their struggles with addiction or other social problems they might be facing, when we intervene in their housing situation, they get healthier, they can take their medication, we can provide stable and consistent mental health interventions. So, you know, it's not rocket science. You know, the solution is housing.
The solution is housing, and this is not like we don't know what to do. It's just a question of whether we have the will to do it. Some would argue that, so we acknowledge that there is a severe supply challenge with affordable housing. Some would argue that strategies like rental assistance have basically serve to fuel demand for housing, thereby driving up housing costs, that it isn't a supply-side tool. Is that accurate? Ms. Yentel, would you like to respond to this? I mean, doesn't rental assistance make the economics of affordable rentals work better for developers and rental property owners?
Yes. So when it comes to very low, extremely low-income households, the amount that they can pay in rent without subsidy doesn't cover the costs to build and operate housing. So federal intervention in the form of subsidy is necessary. And housing choice vouchers are highly effective in communities where there is a sufficient supply of homes, but the people living in them can't afford them. So it acts as a bridge between what people can afford and what rent costs, and allows them to stay stably and affordably housed.
So to suggest, it seems to me, that these kinds of strategies, which are necessary to make housing affordable, is purely a demand-side solution and not getting at, getting at the economics of having more affordable housing, seems to me to be the right way of looking at this.
That's exactly right. As long as we have seniors or people with disabilities on extremely fixed incomes, as long as we have families working very low-wage jobs that are essential to our communities, we have to acknowledge that federal subsidies are necessary to make homes affordable for them. And we have to fund those solutions at scale.
Earlier in the conversation that we've been having here, there was a discussion that I really appreciated about how local zoning restrictions contribute to making affordable housing more expensive to build. My hometown of Minneapolis has done, I think, a model job of creating much more inclusionary zoning. Could you just briefly address what we could be doing at the federal level to support that kind of local, more inclusive zoning?
So and yes, your state is leading the way, really, for the country to look at ways to remove restrictive zoning. Local zoning is, as its name suggests, a local issue, but there are federal incentives or requirements that can be put on local communities. If we look at the large pots of money that states and localities need to run their communities, we should put incentives or requirements on those funds for local communities to do more to remove restrictive zoning. Until we address all of the restrictive zoning that's inhibiting the supply of any kinds of apartments, and especially affordable apartments, even if we're successful in getting the level of funding that we need from the federal government, we won't be able to build. So the federal government should use the levers it has at hand to incentivize or require communities to do more.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Senator Smith. Senator Warnock of Georgia is recognized.
Thank you so very much, Chairman Brown. According to data from the 2020 American Community Survey, around 45% of Georgians spend more than 30% of their income on rent, and 1 in 5 spend more than half of their income on rent. We may assume that these numbers are from high rent cities, but that's not true. It's not just high rent cities. In both Jenkins County and Taylor County, 2 rural counties in the southeast part of my state, 1 out of every 3 households, 1 out of 3, spends more than half their income on rent. Georgians are being crushed by rent all over the state. There's no question that we need more housing stock, and I support many initiatives that would do just that. But Georgians don't have the luxury to wait. They're trying to pay the rent right now. They can't wait several years for rents to fall, and so even as we put forward policy that would increase housing stock, we have to address the housing insecurity that people of Georgia are dealing with right now. Ms. Yentel, how long would you estimate that it will take for our housing supply to finally catch up to demand?
It will take years, if not more than a decade. It's a matter of this restrictive local zoning that needs to be addressed and removed,
right,
and the supply chain issues and many more issues, workforce issues to build the housing. It will take many years for us as a country to dig ourselves out of the supply hole that we created.
So we can't wave a magic wand and it won't go away next year.
That's right.
Or the year after that.
That's
Or
right.
the year after that. So presumably rents will continue to rise in the meantime?
They will continue to rise. Maybe they will start to come down. Even if they do, when we look back to pre-pandemic times,
sure,
many of those numbers in Georgia were likely the same. So even if rents come back to where they were before the pandemic, there are 10 million households throughout the country that are paying at least half of their limited incomes on rent. So yes, they will continue to struggle.
So we had this problem prior to the pandemic, which was then exacerbated by the pandemic. So do you think that offering tax cuts to rent-burdened families, to ordinary hardworking families, would help bridge the gap until we can fully address the housing supply issue?
Absolutely. Cash in people's pockets helps them pay their bills. And whether it's in the form of continued extended child tax credits, which did more to help alleviate child poverty in our country than anything in recent time, or whether it's in the form of renters' tax credits that can also support low-income renters to afford the rent, they can have a meaningful impact on housing affordability.
Right. So I'm a big proponent of tax cuts for hardworking, ordinary families who really could use it. And it seems to me that we need to provide solutions now, given the housing supply issue for Georgians who are feeling squeezed by the rent. And that's why I'm offering and working on legislation right now to do just that, offer tax cuts to families with runaway rent costs. I want to pivot to another question in the few minutes I have. The Low-Income Housing Credit Program, also known as LIHTC, is the most important system for supporting the development of affordable housing. Since Congress created it, the LIHTC program has financed over 3.6 million affordable rental units. However, this affordability is only maintained during the tax credits time period, which is at least 15 years, but could potentially be much longer. One way the affordable period can be reduced, though, is if the property owner requests regulatory relief through a qualified contract. Ms. Yentel, if I can ask you again, can you say more about what it means for a LIHTC property owner to request a qualified contract? What is that?
So it means that owners can essentially get out of the length of the affordability requirement under the low-income housing tax credit program. It's something of a loophole in the program that
So-
needs to be closed.
Great. I'm sorry to interrupt that, but I'm going to be out of time in just a moment. So if another entity buys this property, they could raise the rent?
That's right, even after the federal government has expended resources to build and maintain that property.
Do owners commonly inform the tenants of their buildings that their property might be sold and lose its affordability requirements?
They don't.
They do not. Do you think it would be helpful for HUD to collect and publish data on the LIHTC program? For instance, whether property owners have waived the right to qualified contracts. Would that be helpful information to folks?
Absolutely. More transparency in all federal housing programs is a good thing. At the National Income Housing Coalition, we have a national housing preservation database where we show where properties are at risk, not under qualified contracts, but where their affordability is expiring in coming years, to give that data and transparency for local communities to come up with solutions. But HUD and the Department of Treasury can and should do more.
Thank you so much. LIHTC has been very important around the affordability question, and I'm working on legislation also that will allow us to collect and study data from the LIHTC properties in order to better the program. Thank you so very much.
Thanks, Senator Warnock. I might add that Senator Warnock's comments about tax cuts, I might add for the benefit of his fellow Georgian on the panel that Senator Warnock joined in his about 18 months ago, almost as soon as he came to the Senate, joined me and Senator Bennett on working on the child tax credit, which Matt and I have talked about that, how that relieved the pressure for so many of your tenants, Mr. Dunn. For that year, it was in effect at the end of the month when they got $250 or $300 tax credit. It relieved the anxiety they felt to pay the rent, and they didn't have to deny their family or their children or themselves in those last days of the month. So thank you, Senator Warnock. Thank you. I will close. One of my favorite Abraham Lincoln stories is Lincoln one time said to his staff, wanted to keep him in the White House and win the war and free the slaves and preserve the Union. And Lincoln said, no, I have to go out and get my public opinion bath. And Lincoln would do that when presidents could do that perhaps more openly than they can today. And I urge my colleagues to go out and meet people in their community who struggle to afford rent. Most of us don't interact a whole lot with people who are about to be evicted. They may call our office, but we don't have that personal touch enough. And I urge my colleagues, if we're not doing that as much as perhaps we should, to talk to their staff, talk to people who work at the front desk, who drove to work today, who ask what it's like to rent in D.C. or in Tennessee or Georgia or Pennsylvania. Ask them how many times they have to call their landlord to get a repair made, whether it's lead that goes unrepaired, whether it's a leak that goes unrepaired, what the rent increase was, if they had to cross their fingers and hope the rising rent wouldn't force them to move. Those are everyday stories and people we may come into contact with and don't explore and ask them questions. And I would hope more of us, including myself, would do that. Thanks to the witnesses, all 5 of you remote and the 4 of you here. For senators who wish to submit questions, they're due by close of business 1 week from today, Tuesday, August 9th. To our witnesses, according to our committee rules, we ask you to respond to any questions within 45 days from the day you receive them. Thank you again. The committee's adjourned.